You know, when you buy a brand new smartphone, there is this immediate expectation of universal functionality. Like you unbox it, you turn it on, and you follow the glowing prompts, and it just works.
Right? You don't even think about it.
Exactly. You assume the interface, the icons, the basic logic of the operating system, they're going to make complete sense. Whether you are sitting in a coffee shop in New York, a train in Tokyo, or, I don't know, a remote village in the Andes.
Yeah, it is engineered to be entirely intuitive across the board.
And the thing is, we project that exact same expectation onto human interaction. We really do. We walk into new environments operating under the deeply ingrained assumption that human beings just, well, come pre-installed with a universal operating system for trust, for communication, and for understanding.
And that is exactly where we hit a because the moment we step into the incredibly complex, often messy world of cross-cultural human connection, that intuitive interface is completely shattered. Suddenly, we are looking at a landscape of communication that isn't just a slight variation of what we know, it's a fundamental labyrinth.
Yeah, the gestures don't mean the same thing. The pacing is totally different. Even the way respect is earned is entirely upside down.
Exactly. And navigating that labyrinth requires a completely different set of tools than the ones we use in our native environments. I mean, the strategies that make someone a highly effective leader or a compassionate neighbor in one zip code can easily make them abrasive or confusing or even harmful in another.
Right, so welcome to today's deep dive. We are jumping into a massive thought-provoking stack of source material today, centered around an extensive text titled Cross-Cultural Ministry and Short-Term Missions.
It's a heavy text, but so important.
It really is. And the core mission of our deep dive today is to unpack what this material presents as a radical, ground-up shift in how we approach helping, serving, and leading others, specifically across cultural divides.
Yeah, the overarching argument here is pretty bold.
Very bold. It argues that the absolute greatest barrier to making a meaningful impact in the world isn't a lack of funding.
Yeah.
It isn't a lack of passion or goodwill. The barrier is our baseline assumption that people everywhere hear, trust, and respond in the exact same way we do.
And the stakes here are incredibly high.
Right.
Good intentions, when they're entirely stripped of cultural intelligence, they don't just result in a neutral lack of impact.
No, they cause harm.
They often cause active, lingering harm. They create vast distances of resentment where trust was supposed to have been built. So the primary tension we are going to explore today is the core message or the core help you are trying to deliver might be completely unchanging, but the method of delivering it has to be deeply attentive, highly adaptable, and profoundly human.
I love that. And I want to say this directly to you, the listener. Whether you are leading a multinational corporate team, whether you're managing a remote workforce across different time zones, or whether you are traveling abroad for nonprofit work, or just trying to understand a neighbor who grew up in a completely different socioeconomic reality than you did, this deep dive is going to challenge your baseline assumption.
It definitely will.
The source material uses the lens of religious missions and biblical theology, sure, but it essentially functions as a masterclass in human connection, in cultural intelligence, and in what it calls the theology of faithful presence. So let's jump right into the deep end. The material starts by completely dismantling something we all tend to lean on as our ultimate safety net, which is our good intentions.
Right. It tackles the illusion of good intentions without any hesitation.
Yeah.
The premise is that the very first mistake in cross-cultural work, or really any boundary-crossing leadership, is actually a lack of imagination, not a lack of love.
A lack of imagination. That is such a specific, striking phrase. Because when I think of bad cross-cultural interactions, I usually think of arrogance or ignorance. But imagination.
Yeah, I mean, if we look at the psychological mechanism behind how we operate, a lack of imagination simply means an inability to picture a world where your default settings are not the center of the universe.
Oh, wow.
Right. Well-meaning teams, corporate leaders, or volunteers will arrive in a new context with a profound lack of imagination regarding how different the social and emotional landscape actually is.
They carry their homegrown strategies in their suitcases.
Exactly. They implement the exact same training modules, the same communication styles, the same project timelines, and they expect universal results. They literally cannot imagine that their way of communicating truth or efficiency isn't the default human setting.
Which leads to a fascinating dynamic when things inevitably break down. Because when the new team doesn't hit their targets or the local community doesn't respond to the outreach program, The human instinct isn't usually to pause and rethink the method.
No, not at all.
The instinct is to push harder, to speak louder, to send more emails, to mandate more meetings.
Yes, we mistake a translation problem for a motivation problem.
No, that's good. Say that again.
We mistake a translation problem for a motivation problem. When the outcomes fall short, the outsider assumes the host culture just needs more of the outsider's energy. The material explicitly warns against this. It calls it exporting faith or exporting methods.
Exporting, like treating it as a commodity.
Exactly. Exporting assumes a dynamic of ownership and superiority. It treats the host culture as an empty vessel, a blank slate that is just passively waiting to be filled by the superior wisdom, the superior systems, or the superior theology of the outsider.
Okay, let's unpack this, because there is a brilliant concept here regarding how we measure our own success when we cross these borders.
Yeah, this part is really convicting.
It is. The material talks about mistaking motion for mission. And I immediately thought about how often we see this in the corporate world, but the text specifically applies it to short-term missions and volunteer work. It points out that these endeavors can so easily devolve into spiritual tourism.
Spiritual tourism. That is a devastating critique.
Seriously.
It describes a scenario where people travel, expend a massive amount of energy, take a bunch of photos, and come back home with highly emotional stories about how much the trip changed them.
Right. It becomes all about their experience.
Exactly. The focus of the entire endeavor subtly shifts from the impact on the community to the emotional experience of the visitor.
Right. And meanwhile, what is the host community experiencing? Like,
Yeah.
what do they remember after the vans drive away?
Often, not what the visitors hope they remember.
No. They often remember the visitors not for the incredible message they brought or the clinic they built, but for the jarring assumptions they made. They remember the cultural steamroller.
And the root of that steamroller effect is cultural blindness. We assume that our specific relationship with time, for instance, is an objective reality rather than a cultural construct.
That's a huge one. Time.
It's massive. If we come from a hyper-punctual, task-oriented culture, we view efficiency as a moral good. We assume that if we are being efficient, we are being effective.
Yeah, it's just expected.
But in a highly relational, high-context culture, prioritizing a schedule over a lingering conversation isn't seen as efficient. It's seen as deeply offensive and untrustworthy.
Wow.
You cannot effectively deliver a message of love or partnership if your body language and your schedule are communicating impatience and dominance.
It's like bringing a high-powered American appliance to Europe without an adapter. You have this incredible top-of-the-line blender, the power is there, the intent to make something great is there.
I love this analogy.
But without the right translation, the adapter to convert the electrical current, you are just going to blow a fuse. The host culture is the electrical grid, and your appliance, no matter how expensive or well-intentioned, just isn't built for it out of the box. You have to translate the power.
That is exactly what happens.
But here's where I want to push back on the material, or at least voice the frustration that a lot of leaders and messengers might feel reading this. Shouldn't the truth just speak for itself? Like, if the message is objectively good, if the medical help being offered is genuinely life-saving, or if the business strategy is empirically proven, why is the burden placed so heavily on the messenger to adapt?
Right, why not just deliver the goods?
Exactly. Doesn't the sheer value of what's being offered transcend the need for an adapter?
What's fascinating here is how directly the source addresses that exact pushback.
Okay, what does it say?
The argument is that the messenger is never given permission to be careless with people just because the message is important. In fact, the importance of the message is exactly why the messenger must adapt.
Oh, that flips it entirely.
It does. The material explicitly points out that a phrase, a tone of voice, or a gesture that communicates warmth, urgency, and love in one community might sound deeply abrasive, arrogant, or dismissive in another.
So you could be saying something beautiful, and they hear an insult.
Exactly. The burden falls heavily on the messenger, because the ultimate goal is not merely to broadcast a message into the void to clear one's own conscience. The goal is to actually have it received and understood.
So simply standing on a street corner or, in a boardroom and yelling the truth doesn't count as successful communication if everyone listening thinks you're attacking them.
Not at all.
The material draws a hard line between broadcasting and embodying.
And embodying requires humility, which leads to the material's severe warning against paternalism.
Let's talk about that. Paternalism.
Paternalism is the act of doing things for people rather than partnering with them. When outsiders arrive to, quote-unquote, fix a situation, they frequently bypass local leaders.
Because it's faster.
Right. Right. But the text focuses heavily on partnering with the local church or the existing local leadership, arguing that they are the living, breathing body in that specific place. They know the dialect, they understand the generational trauma, they know the complex social hierarchies, and they understand the actual battlegrounds far better than any visiting expert with a 3-week itinerary ever could.
That makes total sense. If you bypass the local leaders because your spreadsheet says it's faster to just do it yourself, you are implicitly communicating that your cultural efficiency is vastly more valuable than their lived reality and their dignity.
You are communicating superiority, straight up. The text poses a highly uncomfortable question for anyone crossing a cultural line. Are we going merely to help from a position of perceived strength? Or are we actually willing to learn from a position of vulnerability?
Wow.
Are we entering a space to fix what we don't understand, or to faithfully serve in ways that honor the agency of the people who already live there?
That is a staggering paradigm shift. If relying on our own cultural default settings just leads to blown fuses, and if relying on our good intentions isn't enough to prevent toxic paternalism, where are we supposed to look for the correct blueprint? Like, if the smartphone operating system doesn't work, what is the alternative?
Well, the source material doesn't just leave us in the wreckage of our blown fuses.
Thankfully.
It points us directly to the original ultimate model of crossing a boundary. It takes us deep into the theological concept of the Incarnation.
Okay, let's get into this. There is a line in the text that absolutely stopped me in my tracks. It says, God did not shout salvation from a safe distance.
That is a powerful line.
It completely upends how humans usually handle power. Because when humans have ultimate authority or ultimate resources, we tend to consolidate it in a tower or a headquarters, and we delegate the dirty work downward.
Right, we distance ourselves from the mess.
Exactly. But the text says God descended. He adapted. He entered a very specific, deeply constrained first-century human reality. He dealt with the dust, the politics, the language, and the limitations of that specific culture without losing his core holiness.
Applying that to modern leadership is revolutionary. The material emphasizes that God chose nearness. He didn't just send a manual. He took on flesh, local dialects, and cultural context.
He became human.
Yes, he participated in the local customs of a specific Jewish community in the ancient Near East. And the author uses this to argue a profound point. If God himself chose nearness, vulnerability, and cultural adaptation as the primary means to connect with humanity, then distance, rigidity, and cultural imperialism cannot possibly be the posture of anyone who claims to represent him.
It completely invalidates the helicopter model of leadership or missions where you just drop in, deliver the goods, and fly back to safety.
Exactly.
The text unpacks this incarnational model by looking at how Jesus actually operated on a day-to-day basis. There is a massive, relentless emphasis on proximity. Sure, Jesus occasionally ministered to multitudes. He fed crowds. He spoke on hillsides. But he formed the 12.
And that's a huge distinction.
It is. He spent the vast majority of his time walking on dusty roads, touching people society had deemed untouchable, eating at mundane dinner tables, and constantly allowing his schedule to be interrupted by marginalized people.
That sharp distinction between the crowd and the few is critical to understanding the mechanism of change here. I mean, a crowd can be impressed. A crowd can be entertained or inspired by a great speech.
Sure.
But a disciple, a true learner, must be transformed.
Yeah.
Transformation, the text insists, almost never happens at a distance. It requires the friction and the intimacy of proximity. It happens when lives intersect deeply enough and long enough for abstract truth to become a personal reality.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me, especially when we try to apply this to the modern world. I am thinking about you, the listener, navigating your career, your volunteer work, or your community. Modern culture, modern business, modern nonprofits, even modern religious institutions is completely obsessed with scale.
Oh, completely.
We are addicted to metrics. We want to know how many people attended the conference, what the reach of the platform is, how many unique views a video got, and how quickly we can scale our impact to a global level.
It's all about bigger and faster.
Right. So how in the world does the text reconcile our modern, overwhelming desire for massive, instantaneous reach with Jesus's incredibly slow, small-scale, deeply inefficient approach to focusing on just 12 people?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the fundamental logic of this model isn't efficiency. It is formation.
Formation.
Yes. The author highlights a very specific, easily overlooked verse, Mark 3:14. It notes that Jesus called the disciples that they might be with him before he ever sent them out to preach or do any actual work.
That they might be with him. The relationship and the proximity came before the assignment.
Formation precedes function. Our modern impulse is the exact opposite. We want to rush people into service. We want to scale the operation, launch the product, or expand the nonprofit long before the character of the team is actually formed to sustain it.
We want the results without the roots.
Exactly. But the text argues that in small proximate spaces, accountability isn't something you have to mandate through corporate policy or strict oversight. It emerges naturally through shared life. The text introduces this beautiful concept of the theological space of the dinner table.
I love that phrase, the theological space of the dinner table.
Isn't it great? When you eat with someone, you are engaging in a fundamentally leveling act. Defenses lower. You aren't standing over them at a podium. Stories are told.
Right, it's just human to human.
The pace of the interaction slows down enough for actual trust to take root. You observe how they treat the server, how they listen, how they react to disagreement. The table is where true culture is transferred.
Tables do what podiums cannot. A podium broadcasts a message to a crowd, but a table connects individuals. And if your cross-cultural work or your leadership is about entering someone's world and walking beside them at a table, it demands a very specific, very rare kind of authority.
It really does.
It fundamentally alters what it means to be a leader. Because if you are leading from the dinner table rather than the distant corner office or the elevated stage, you can't just operate as a manager.
No, you can't.
Which brings us to one of the most challenging sections of the source text, the hard, uncompromising line it draws between the manager and the shepherd.
It is an absolute contrast. The material argues that the modern world defines leadership almost exclusively by management and performance metrics, coordinating tasks, optimizing systems, mitigating risk, and keeping the assembly line moving.
Which is what we're all taught in school, right?
Exactly. But biblical leadership, which is the model for this cross-cultural work, is framed entirely around the metaphor of shepherding.
And to build this profile of a shepherd, the text draws heavily on massive ancient passages. Psalm 23, Ezekiel 34, and John 10. It synthesizes these into 4 core functions of a shepherd. Know, walk with, protect, and feed the sheep. Let's really break these down, because they run so counter to the MBA style of leadership we are constantly taught to emulate today.
Let's do it. Let's look at the first function, which is know. The text is very careful to specify that this refers to deeply relational knowing, not mere informational knowing.
Okay, what's the difference?
Well, informational knowing is having the data that a certain demographic exists in your target area, or knowing the quarterly output of your team. It's stats. Relational knowing is knowing their names, is knowing their specific habits, their underlying fears, the trauma that triggers their reactions, and their specific patterns of wandering.
Wow.
A manager can successfully oversee a massive system without ever deeply knowing the people inside it. A shepherd absolutely cannot.
Which bleeds right into the second function, which is walk with. This is about sharing the pace and sharing the terrain. It is the antithesis of leading from an ivory tower or sending directives down from a distant headquarters.
Right, you're down in the mud with them.
The text says a shepherd travels with the flock. If you are walking with people, you are physically and emotionally sharing their burdens. You are experiencing the same weather, the same exhaustion, the same difficult terrain. You are present in the mundane, ordinary struggles of daily life, not just parachuting in for the high-stakes crisis management meetings.
And because you are present in the terrain, you are equipped for the third function, which is
Protection. Okay.
The text makes a brilliant, vital distinction here by contrasting the good shepherd with the hired hand mentioned in the Gospel of John. The hired hand might look like a shepherd when the weather is nice, but the hired hand abandons the flock the moment the wolf appears.
Because they don't actually care.
Exactly. Why? Because the sheep aren't truly his. He has no skin in the game. He's just there for a paycheck or to build his resume. But the true shepherd protects the flock. And importantly, the material notes that this protection isn't just against external threats or hostile forces outside the community.
What else is it against?
It is also protection against internal toxicity. A good shepherd establishes boundaries, addresses toxic patterns within the group, and fiercely refuses to allow the vulnerable to be exploited by the powerful. Protection is an active, often costly stance.
Then finally, there's the fourth function, which is feed. This is providing spiritual nourishment, or in a broader organizational context, providing the truth, the encouragement, the resources, and the practical wisdom that actually sustains life.
It's not just handing out to-do lists.
Right. It is not just assigning tasks or setting deadlines. It is constantly asking, what do these specific people need right now to grow, to heal, and to be strengthened for the road ahead? But as beautiful as this model is, the text also issues a stark warning about three specific leadership traps that will absolutely destroy the shepherd model: burnout, control, and detachment.
These are the occupational hazards of anyone who attempts to lead relationally. Burnout happens when a leader gives endlessly, pouring out their empathy and energy without prioritizing their own need to abide, to rest, and to be replenished. They become an empty vessel trying to pour into others.
And what about control?
Control is a trap that grows entirely out of fear. It is the anxious assumption that if the leader isn't personally managing every micro detail, the mission will completely collapse. It suffocates the agency of the people they are trying to lead.
And detachment.
Detachment might be the most insidious. It occurs when a leader has been hurt, betrayed, or simply exhausted by the massive emotional toll of walking with people. To protect themselves from further pain, they retreat.
They pull back.
Yeah. They begin to lead from a safe, emotional distance. They might remain highly functional. They still run the meetings, they still preach the sermons, they still hit the targets, but they become relationally barren. They have reverted to being a manager because it is safer than being a shepherd.
Okay, I have to jump in here and push back on this because the modern professional in me, and probably in a lot of people listening, is screaming at this exact
I
point.
get it.
Let's look at a fast-paced environment. Let's say you are on a 2-week short-term mission trip to build a retaining wall before the rainy season starts. Or you are running a pop-up medical clinic in a crisis zone, or you are a project manager with a critical launch date. Isn't hardline management totally undeniably necessary? It reminds me of a triage nurse in an emergency room. When a patient comes through the doors actively bleeding, the nurse does not pull up a chair to ask about their childhood fears. They don't walk with them through their complex emotional terrain. They just need to stop the bleeding. They execute the task efficiently. Doesn't the shepherding model just completely break down in environments where speed and logistics are required?
This raises an important question, and it is a tension the text directly anticipates. The author is not naive. The material does not invalidate the need for logistics, for budgets, for timelines, or for executing critical tasks.
Okay.
Those are matters of basic stewardship.
Okay.
But the text forces us to examine the ultimate underlying goal of the interaction. A manager looks at a complex situation, say the building of that retaining wall or the running of that clinic, and asks one primary question. Was the task completed on time and under budget?
Which is what we're all measured on.
Right. But a shepherd looks at the exact same situation, oversees the exact same project, but asks a fundamentally different question. Was the person strengthened in the process?
Wow. Was the task completed versus was the person strengthened? That is the entire paradigm shift in one sentence.
Exactly. If we look at the triage analogy, yes, you must stop the bleeding. But the text argues for the absolute necessity of emotional and spiritual intelligence alongside logistical execution.
So you can't just be a robot fixing a problem.
No. If you are only focused on the physical task, you might successfully suture the wound while completely stripping the patient of their dignity through your bedside manner. In the context of a mission trip, a highly efficient team can successfully build a magnificent retaining wall, and in the process, completely wound, alienate, and humiliate the local community by treating them as an obstacle to efficiency rather than as partners.
And the manager accepts that collateral damage if the wall gets built?
Yes, the shepherd refuses that trade-off.
Because the people are the point, not the project. But to be a shepherd, you have to intimately understand the environment your flock is living in. You have to know the terrain, like you said earlier. But what happens when that terrain is no longer the green pastures of Psalm 23?
That changes things.
What happens when the flock or the leader is placed in an environment that is entirely hostile, an environment that is unfamiliar, foreign, and completely disorienting? This takes us into what might be the most fascinating section of the source text, the deep dive into the biblical concept of exile.
This section contains some of the most profound theological and psychological arguments in the entire material. It completely dismantles a deeply ingrained assumption that most of us hold, consciously or unconsciously.
Which is what?
We tend to operate under the belief that God only works, or that we can only be truly effective in places of comfort, sanctuary, or ideal conditions. We assume that if our environment is stable, familiar, and supportive, it means we are in the center of providence. And conversely, if things are disorienting, foreign, and difficult, we assume something has gone terribly wrong.
We assume discomfort equals divine absence.
Yes, exactly.
But the text says, point blank, exile is not absence. It argues that historically, God actually does his deepest, most transformative work in conditions of severe displacement. It provides three massive biblical case studies to prove this point, showing how individuals navigated completely foreign, hostile environments. Moses, Daniel, and Esther. Let's start with Moses. The text describes his formation as happening between worlds.
The psychology of Moses is fascinating. He is Hebrew by birth, but he is raised in the absolute epicenter of Egyptian royalty and power.
Right, he's a prince.
Yeah. Then, after a massive failure, he spends a long, grueling season as a Midianite shepherd in the wilderness. For decades, he doesn't truly belong anywhere. The text points out that this wilderness period wasn't a wasted detour or a punishment. It was a sacred interval. God used the starkness of the desert to strip away the prince's illusion of self-sufficiency.
The text uses this incredible phrase. It says, fragmentation became divine preparation for mediation. Think about the psychology of that. Because Moses belonged to multiple worlds but was fully at home in none of them, he experienced a profound fragmentation of identity.
He was caught in the middle.
But that exact fragmentation was what uniquely positioned him to be the ultimate bridge. He was the only person alive who had the deep, visceral empathy to understand Hebrew suffering, while simultaneously possessing the insider knowledge of how to navigate and confront Egyptian power. His complex, uncomfortable, displaced identity was exactly what made him the perfect instrument for liberation.
Which leads us to Daniel. Daniel is presented in the text as the ultimate enduring model of faithful presence without a compromise in the heart of a hostile empire.
Right, Babylon.
Yes, Daniel is forcibly dragged into exile in Babylon. His entire world is destroyed. But look at his response. He doesn't isolate himself. He doesn't build a bunker. He actively engages the Babylonian system. He learns their complex language, he studies their literature, and he even serves at the highest levels of their government.
And this is the crucial part, he never surrenders his ultimate allegiance.
Exactly. He is present without being absorbed. He learns the language of Babylon, but he refuses to worship the gods of Babylon. The text highlights that his witness in this completely foreign land was not found in angry withdrawal or in violent rebellion, but in steadfast, quiet holiness lived out within public life.
He didn't just fight them, but he didn't join them either.
Right. He proves that spiritual vitality and integrity can actually flourish even in the most hostile moral climate imaginable.
And then there's Esther. Her story is framed entirely around the concept of providential placement. She's a marginalized Jewish orphan who is swept up and placed inside the inner workings of a terrifying, volatile Persian political system. She didn't choose this environment.
Not at all.
She is surrounded by constant danger and hidden agendas, but she is placed there for the explicit purpose of advocacy. It leads to that famous realization. She was put in the palace for such a time as this. I want you, the listener, to really think about your own life right now. How often do we assume that because the situation at work is toxic, or because we feel utterly alienated in our neighborhood, or because we are struggling to understand a new culture, that we must have made a wrong turn?
We view extreme discomfort as proof that we missed the exit for the right path.
Right. But Esther's placement in the Persian court looked like extreme inconvenience, isolation, and mortal danger long, long before it ever looked like divine purpose. Her supreme discomfort was actually her assignment. Her proximity to power, which terrified her, was the exact tool needed to save her people.
The author uses the overlapping lessons of Moses, Daniel, and Esther to warn against two opposite, equally destructive errors that people make when they find themselves in an exile environment, whether that is an actual foreign country or just a corporate culture that fundamentally opposes their values.
What are the two errors?
The first error is assimilation. This is when you become so exhausted by being different that you just blend in. You become indistinguishable from the surrounding culture. You adopt their ethics, their ruthlessness, their metrics for success, and you completely lose your distinct witness.
You just become another Babylonian.
Precisely. The second error, on the other end of the spectrum, is retreat. This is when you are so terrified of the culture's influence that you isolate yourself completely. You build a cultural bunker, you only interact with people who think exactly like you, and you entirely abandon your vocation to serve, to translate, and to bless the broader city you are living in.
So Daniel, Moses, and Esther all found the razor-thin middle ground. They rejected both assimilation and retreat.
They did. And the text explains that the experience of exile, of being the outsider, is deeply necessary because it teaches believers that they are ultimately pilgrims. It prevents them from ever confusing earthly comfort or political power or cultural dominance with ultimate belonging.
It keeps them grounded.
Yes, it forces them to rely entirely on God, who consistently meets them in the margins and reveals his power through their steadfastness in the unfamiliar.
So Moses, Daniel, and Esther give us a masterclass in how to faithfully navigate being the outsider, the foreigner in a strange land. But the source text doesn't stop there. It pivots, and it holds up a mirror to show us how the insider, the person who is comfortable, the person who holds the power, reacts when the foreigner comes to them.
This is where it gets really convicting.
It really does. And this brings us to a stunning, deeply convicting section that the text calls the scandal of grace. It highlights a massive contrast between two very different biblical figures, Ruth and Jonah.
This section is arguably the most searching part of the entire text. It places Ruth, whose story reveals the breathtaking, expansive beauty of receiving grace, right next to Jonah, whose story exposes the dark, territorial human resistance to extending grace to others.
It's quite the contrast.
It is. The overarching theological argument here is critical. God's family, his kingdom, is built entirely and exclusively on divine mercy. Not on cultural similarity, not on shared traditions, and certainly not on ethnic pedigree.
Let's unpack the story of Ruth first. The text places a huge emphasis on her background. She is a Moabite widow. Now, for the listener who might not know the ancient geopolitics, the Moabites were not just foreigners. They were historically the bitter enemies of Israel.
There is deep generational animosity there.
Exactly. She represents the ultimate outsider. By every metric of the culture, she does not belong anywhere near the inner circle of God's people.
She begins her story completely beyond the edge of inherited promise. But she demonstrates this fierce, unprecedented, covenantal loyalty to her Israelite mother-in-law, Naomi. She leaves her homeland and travels to Israel. And when she arrives, she encounters Boaz.
And Boaz responds completely differently than you'd expect.
Yes, the text makes a profound point here to highlight Boaz's practical, embodied hospitality. He doesn't just look at this foreign widow and offer abstract sympathy or a quick prayer.
He leverages his power.
He leverages his power for her protection.
Yeah.
He actively protects her from harassment in the fields. He instructs his workers to deliberately leave extra grain behind for her to gather. He ensures she is fed and safe. It is a hospitality of action, not just sentiment.
And the text points out the staggering result of this grace. Through Boaz's hospitality and Ruth's faithfulness, this outsider, this enemy by birth, is brought into the very epicenter of redemption history. She marries Boaz and becomes the great-grandmother of King David, which places her directly in the genealogy of Jesus Christ.
It's incredible.
The text stresses that belonging in the kingdom is entirely rewritten by grace. It completely bypasses your ethnic pedigree or your cultural resume.
And just as we are marveling at the beauty of Ruth's inclusion, the text abruptly pivots to Jonah.
Oh, Jonah.
Jonah serves as a stark, profoundly uncomfortable warning to anyone who thinks they're on the inside. Jonah is the ultimate insider. He is a recognized prophet of Israel. He knows God's theology perfectly.
He's the guy you expect to get it right.
Right. But when God calls him to go preach a message of repentance to Nineveh, which was the violent, brutal imperial capital of Assyria, Jonah runs in the exact opposite direction.
And the text makes a crucial psychological observation here. Jonah does not flee because he is confused by the assignment, or because he doubts God's power, or even because he is simply afraid of the Ninevites.
No, he flees because he deeply, fundamentally resents God's mercy.
That is wild. He resents mercy.
Jonah knows exactly who God is. He knows God is gracious, compassionate, and slow to anger. And Jonah is absolutely terrified that if he preaches to Nineveh, God might actually forgive his enemies. He wants the Assyrians destroyed, not redeemed.
So he literally runs away so they can't be saved.
Exactly. Later in the story, when he eventually goes and Nineveh actually repents and God spares the city, Jonah isn't celebrating a successful mission. He is furious. He sits outside the city, essentially throwing a tantrum, angry enough to ask God to kill him because he is so disgusted by God's grace.
So what does this all mean? Like for us, I kept trying to picture Jonah's mindset, and it's like imagine Jonah as a guy standing in a massive, catastrophic thunderstorm, but he is holding the only umbrella.
Right.
He is safe, he is dry, and he feels entirely justified in his comfort. And then suddenly the rain stops for everyone else too. The clouds part, the sun comes out, and the people he hates are no longer drowning. Instead of being happy that the storm is over, he is absolutely furious that he is no longer the only one who is dry.
That's a perfect image.
Jonah wants grace to operate as a private VIP pass. He views it as a country club membership for his specific tribe. He does not want it to be a public reality available to his enemies.
It is a devastating critique of human nature. And what's fascinating here is that Jonah exposes the hidden toxic sin of tribal mercy.
Tribal mercy, what does that mean exactly?
Tribal mercy is loving the idea of grace when it covers your own community, your own political party, or your own family, but despising it when it reaches across the border to the people you find repugnant. The text points out a terrifying reality for anyone involved in cross-cultural work, leadership, or ministry. It is entirely possible to speak the perfect vocabulary of obedience, to endure the hardships of travel, to complete the mission, while inwardly despising the very people you have been called to serve.
You can possess flawless doctrine and have zero actual compassion. You can build the clinic while hating the patients.
Which is why the true miracle of the Jonah story, according to the text, is not the spectacular event of him surviving inside a giant fish. The true underlying miracle is that God is relentlessly, patiently trying to convert the prophet's heart just as much as he is trying to convert the city of Nineveh.
Wow.
God is exposing the hardened borders in Jonah's heart to show him that divine mercy is infinitely wider than human prejudice.
And this incredible radical expansion of God's boundaries, this relentless move beyond tribalism, beyond ethnic borders, beyond Jonah's comfortable VIP section, it all culminates in the New Testament.
Yes, it does.
The text asks a massive logistical and theological question here. Once you start including all these diverse outsiders like Ruth and all these reluctant insiders like Jonah, how do you unify them? How does God take this incredibly diverse collision of cultures, languages, and backgrounds and forge them into one community without destroying what makes them beautifully unique?
It's the ultimate problem of community building.
Right. That brings us to the final major theme of the source material: Pentecost and the early church.
The text presents the events of Acts chapter 2, the day of Pentecost, as a literal theological earthquake. The disciples are gathered in Jerusalem, the Holy Spirit descends upon them, and they spill out into the streets to proclaim the gospel. But the miracle isn't just that they have courage.
No, it's what happens with the languages.
Exactly. The miracle is that the massive crowds of pilgrims who have traveled from all over the known world hear the message proclaimed in their own native regional languages.
The text argues that this specific detail is the ultimate proof that God does not flatten humanity into a monolithic sameness. He doesn't force everyone to learn one holy language like Hebrew or Aramaic in order to access the truth. He meets them exactly where they are. He redeems people within their diversity, not by erasing it.
The author creates a brilliant, overarching biblical contrast here between the story of the Tower of Babel in the Old Testament and the miracle of Pentecost in the New Testament.
Okay, let's break that down. Babel.
At Babel, humanity attempted to achieve unity through human engineering, pride, and linguistic uniformity. They wanted to build a tower to the heavens to make a name for themselves, and that forced, prideful uniformity resulted in divine judgment, confusion, and scattering. Babel was an attempt at a monoculture without God.
And Pentecost.
Pentecost, however, is the exact opposite. It is spirit-filled unity where human differences are not annihilated, but what the text calls sanctified.
Sanctified difference. I really love that concept. It completely changes how we view diversity.
The different languages, the different cultural expressions, aren't erased as if they were a mistake. They are consecrated to carry the ultimate truth. The text dives deep into how the early Christian church had to wrestle with the implications of this immediately.
Right, because it wasn't just a one-day event. They had to live it out.
Yes. In Acts chapter 15, at the Jerusalem Council, the church leaders faced a massive existential crisis of culture. Did Gentile converts, the outsiders, have to become culturally Jewish in order to truly belong to Christ? Did they have to adopt the Jewish dietary laws, the cultural markers like circumcision, the specific calendar of festivals?
Were they required to use the Jewish adapter to plug into the grace of God? And the stunning answer from the early church was no. The gospel did not require cultural assimilation.
It was a monumental decision. The early church demonstrated what the text calls the wisdom of flexibility. The apostles realized they could adapt their language, their tone, their leadership structures, and their pace without ever compromising the core, unchanging truth of the resurrection.
They figured out what was core and what was cultural.
Exactly. They understood that the gospel message was inherently strong enough and transcendent enough to travel across vast cultural lines without needing to be rigidly propped up by the scaffolding of Jewish cultural traditions.
I want to bring this directly back to you, the listener,
Yeah.
because we see this exact tension playing out all the time today. We see it in boardrooms, we see it in community organizations, and yes, we see it in churches. We see institutions demanding that you look, talk, dress, and act exactly like the original founders if you want to be considered a true culture fit and be fully accepted.
We see that everywhere.
It is often just forced assimilation dressed up as corporate unity. So how does the text say we can actually tell the difference between protecting the essential, non-negotiable truth of a mission versus just aggressively protecting our own comfortable cultural preferences?
The text warns that confusing fidelity to the truth with the desire for cultural control is one of the most dangerous, subtle temptations in any human organization. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the body of Christ in the biblical context is designed to function like a thriving ecosystem, not a monoculture.
An ecosystem.
Yes, in a monoculture, only one type of crop is allowed to grow, and it eventually strips the soil of all its nutrients. But in a healthy ecosystem, highly diverse elements interact, support one another, and create a resilient, vibrant life that could never exist in uniformity.
The gospel, or a truly healthy organizational culture, redeems people without erasing their personality. A quiet, contemplative, highly analytical person doesn't need to become loud, extroverted, and performative to be considered a faithful contributor. A highly rhythmic, expressive, emotionally driven person doesn't need to become restrained, stoic, and muted to be considered professional or holy.
The Spirit sanctifies temperament without destroying it. The expert cross-cultural messenger, or the mature leader, fundamentally understands that their own personal cultural habits are not universal laws of human nature.
They are just habits.
Exactly. The text reiterates this powerfully at the end. A rigid messenger who demands that everyone conform to their specific style of communication or their specific timeline inevitably becomes a massive barrier to the truth they are trying to share. But a wise, flexible messenger who practices the discipline of listening and adapting becomes a bridge.
A bridge instead of a barrier. And that brings us perfectly full circle to where we started this entire conversation. As we wrap up this deep dive, the core synthesis of this massive text is that cross-cultural ministry, and honestly all forms of faithful, mature human leadership, is ultimately about presence.
It really is.
It is about humility. It is about the hard work of translation. It requires the immense discipline of listening long and hard before you ever open your mouth to start speaking. It requires loving the actual messy, complex, frustrating people sitting directly in front of you, rather than treating them as a metric on a spreadsheet or a project to be completed so you can feel good about yourself.
It requires the daily conscious choice to exchange the efficient, detached mindset of a manager for the deeply involved, vulnerable heart of a shepherd. It means trusting that providence is already at work in the foreign place, in the uncomfortable exile, long before you ever arrive with your solutions. Your job is simply to discern that work and join it, not to invent it from scratch.
I want to leave you with a final provocative thought, a challenge directly inspired by the material we've unpacked today. We've spent this time talking about geographical borders, cultural differences, and historical animosities. But right now, I want you to look at the invisible borders inside your own heart.
That's where the real work is.
Look at the lines drawn by your socioeconomic class, your education level, your political assumptions, or your family background. Ask yourself a really hard question. Is there a Nineveh in your life right now? Is there a specific person, a demographic, or a group of people that you secretly, quietly hope remains outside the reach of grace, outside the reach of success, or outside the reach of forgiveness?
When we strip away our polite vocabulary, that is a terrifying question to ask ourselves honestly.
It really is. It exposes the Jonah in all of us. And consider this final thought. What if that foreign, deeply uncomfortable, incredibly frustrating space you are currently trying so hard to escape, that difficult team at work, that tense neighborhood dynamic, that confusing relationship, what if that is exactly the providential exile where you are meant to be a bridge? What if your deep discomfort is not a sign that you took a wrong turn, but is actually your divine assignment?
Because as we discussed at the very beginning, human beings do not operate on a universal, predictable operating system. We never have.
We don't. We are all wandering through a complex relational labyrinth. But the good news from this material is that we don't have to navigate that labyrinth with rigidity, fear, and control. We can navigate it with a listening ear, with profound grace, and with a faithful, humble presence. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the complexities of crossing cultures and leading with humanity. We encourage you to keep exploring these ideas on your own, keep listening to the people around you, and keep doing the hard work of crossing those invisible boundaries with grace. Until next time.